The lecture hall glittered with certainty. Rows of young faces leaned into the glow of reputation, notebooks open, cameras half raised, waiting to be impressed by a mind the university framed in glass and gold. Chalk dust drifted like quiet snow across the whiteboard, settling over a forest of symbols meant to prove that knowledge lived mainly where prestige pointed. Then the room chose a target. At the front, a polished smile curved beneath perfect light. A hand lifted a marker, tracing an equation in smooth, confident strokes, the kind of performance that expects applause before the answer appears. The other hand gestured toward the back, toward the person the building never advertised. The person who arrived before dawn and left after dark, who polished reflections he was never invited to see himself in. He wore gray, the color the world uses when it wants someone to fade. Work gloves tucked into a belt, name patch stitched at the heart. The floor he mopped held more footsteps than names he could count, and yet none of those names had ever learned his. Laughter arrived in easy waves. It wasn't loud, just sharp, like glass underfoot. A dare floated across the room, wrapped in charm and superiority, dressed as a joke about love and genius, a promise no one meant to keep. The students drank it in, delighted by the arrogance of it, confident that this would end the way such games always do, the uniform embarrassed, the title untouchable. He stood still, not frozen, anchored. Eyes on the board, not the faces. The symbols there were older than any degree, older than the brilliant lights that tried to blind him to what his mind still knew. Limits, integrals, a structure inside the chaos. Years ago, he had moved through these like a swimmer in warm water, breath easy, horizon bright. Years ago, he had a seat in rooms like this, until life demanded tuition in currencies he did not have. The room waited for performance. He offered silence. It was not the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of measurement, the long, steady inhale of someone weighing the difference between cruelty and proof. The equation stared back at him with a small, hidden grin, as if it recognized him the way an old friend recognizes a gate across a crowded street. That familiarity slid across his chest like a key turning. Numbers do not care who writes them, he thought without words. They only answer to truth. The laughter changed. Not louder, thinner. His gaze didn't leave the board, and so the board began to belong to him. A hand somewhere stopped recording. A pair of crossed arms near the aisle loosened. The professor's polished certainty sparkled harder, as if adding shine could replace substance. He had not touched chalk in too long. Life had replaced it with mops, with invoices, with the arithmetic of survival. But memory keeps its own ledger. Formulas slept inside him like seeds waiting for rain, not dead, dormant. The room's heat pressed against his neck. His breath steadied to the rhythm he used to know before exams, before proofs, before the first moment a door closed on talent and called it fate. Images flickered behind his eyes, a library lamp burning past midnight, a printed paper with his name misspelled but his ideas intact, a phone call that ended a semester, a promise made to family and kept at the cost of a future. Humiliation tried to rise and choke him. He let it pass without swallowing. What remained was clean. What remained was focus. He stepped forward, not to plead but to see. Up close, the board revealed its seams, an assumption smuggled into step 3. A sign error hiding in neat handwriting like a thief in a tailored suit. A limit treated as decoration when it was the door. The beauty of it, how a single honest correction could turn a taunt into a doorway, made his chest warm. No one had taught him to carry dignity without witnesses. Life had. He lifted his chin the smallest degree and let the room watch a man remember himself. Across the hall, the students' faces reassembled. Titters stalled. Pens lowered. The tiniest hush gathered above the seats like a storm choosing its edge. He didn't move toward the marker yet. He let the gravity of the work call to him first, the way tide summons moonlight. Confidence, the quiet kind, began to radiate, not the performance of knowing, but the relief of recognizing. Somewhere in the crowd, admiration blinked awake inside shame. Somewhere else, envy panicked and tried to laugh again. But the sound had lost its footing. The dare that landed as humiliation now hovered like a trap for the one who set it. He could feel the old rhythm returning: definition, substitution, simplification, truth. Not the show. The method. The same cadence that had once made him believe classrooms could be homes and futures could be earned. He let the room's lights burn against him and refused to squint. If they wanted a spectacle, they would have to watch a resurrection. He reached the edge of the whiteboard and paused. In the gloss, his reflection stood beside the equation, uniform and mind sharing the same small square of light. He didn't smile. He didn't harden. He allowed himself only one concession to the moment, a breath that ended in steadiness, the promise tossed at him, the one dressed as romance, built as a joke, meant as a leash, hung in the air with nowhere to land. The room had been asked to believe that love and genius are toys of the powerful. The room was about to learn that truth belongs to whoever honors it. And as chalk finally met board, the first soft line drew more than a stroke. It drew a border between spectacle and lesson, between arrogance and accountability, between who the world said he was and who he had never stopped being. The hall leaned forward. Humiliation had started the hour. Revelation had just begun it. Morning light crawled across the empty university. Halls like truth searching for a place to rest. Before the classrooms filled with chatter, before pens scratched pages and minds performed brilliance for applause, he was already there. The hum of fluorescent lights greeted him like an old friend who never asked questions. He moved with practiced silence, pushing the cart of cleaning supplies, bucket rolling softly over polished tiles. The air smelled faintly of bleach and ambition. Every corridor he mopped shone brighter than the one before. Each reflection a reminder that some people spend their lives cleaning mirrors, but never get to see themselves clearly in one. The walls whispered history, names etched on brass plates, awards lined in glass, portraits of professors who smiled without knowing his existence. He passed them daily, their eyes frozen in timeless pride, staring through him like he was air. He had once walked these same corridors differently, not as a shadow, but as a promise. Years ago, he had stood inside lecture halls not with gloves, but with notebooks. Not with a broom, but with equations. He was the student everyone asked for help, the one professors quietly admired but never mentored. He had seen patterns where others saw problems, found beauty in logic, rhythm in numbers. Mathematics wasn't just a subject. It was his sanctuary, his prayer, his proof that the world had an order he could trust, until life changed the formula. A phone call, a hospital bill, a choice between family and future. Dreams have a cost, and his came due too soon. Tuition became a luxury, textbooks became memories, and brilliance turned into survival. He left the university not as a graduate, but as a ghost. And when he returned years later, it was through a different door, the one marked maintenance staff only. He didn't mind at first. Work was honest. He kept his head down, found rhythm in routine. Every night, while others lectured about theory and progress, he cleaned the spaces where those ideas were born. And sometimes, as he wiped whiteboards clean, faint traces of chalk remained, little ghosts of equations that refused to vanish completely. He liked those moments. It was as if the board remembered him. He would trace the fading symbols with his finger, whispering the solutions silently in his mind. Sometimes he corrected the mistakes professors left behind, errors hidden under complex confidence. It was harmless, almost therapeutic. The numbers still spoke to him, even if the world didn't. Then there was her, Dr. Evelyn Cross. She was the department's pride. Brilliant, beautiful, fearless, and completely sure of herself. Her lectures filled every seat. Her confidence filled every silence. To her students, she was genius personified, intellect wrapped in elegance. To him, she was a reminder of what the world rewards. Not just knowledge, but the privilege to display it. She passed him often without noticing. Most people did. He'd hold the door open, mop the floors, replace light bulbs in her lecture hall, always invisible, always efficient. But one evening changed that. He was fixing a flickering light after hours. The classroom was empty except for the whiteboard, still covered in a storm of equations. He paused, eyes drawn to the pattern. It was complex as a fluid dynamics proof, elegant but flawed. The error was small, almost invisible, but to someone who once breathed this language, it screamed. He picked up a marker, just for a moment, just to see if he still could. His hand trembled at first, but the rhythm returned easily. One correction led to another, and before he realized it, the equation was complete. Perfect. The next morning, he found the board erased. No one knew, no one cared, but deep inside, a spark he'd buried long ago began to glow again. For days, he caught himself glancing at her lectures, not with resentment, but curiosity. She was brilliant, yes, but sometimes careless, too sure, too fast. Confidence makes even the smartest forget humility, and she had built her brilliance on applause, not accuracy. The turning point came a week later. A class was in session. He was quietly mopping the back floor, headphones in, pretending not to listen. But her voice, loud and animated, carried through the hall. She was presenting an unsolved mathematical problem, a challenge meant to test her brightest students. It sprawled across the board like an unsolved riddle from the universe itself. The students struggled, whispering guesses, exchanging nervous glances. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sparkled with superiority. Her tone dripped with playful arrogance, a show of intellect more than a lesson. And then it happened. A student near the back muttered something. She paused, turned, and her gaze landed on him. For the first time, her attention pierced the invisible barrier between brilliance and servitude. He froze, caught in a gaze that had never once seen him before. The room quieted. A spark of mockery lit her eyes. A question was tossed his way, harmless yet sharp, coated in humor but edged in insult. The class giggled. The hierarchy was clear, her power, his place. He smiled faintly and returned to his work. But she wasn't done. Arrogance never stops when it finds an audience. She turned the challenge into theater, pointing toward the board, inviting him to try. The laughter grew louder. She loved that moment. The control, the dominance, the proof that genius had boundaries and she owned them. But humiliation, when met with grace, becomes a mirror. He didn't argue. He didn't shrink. He just stood still, quiet, calm, unreadable. The laughter felt smaller now, uncertain. He looked at the board for a heartbeat too long, and in that silence, something in the air changed. The mocking smile on her face faltered, just slightly, but enough to unsettle her. Later, when the bell rang and the students left, she stayed behind, amused but curious. She couldn't shake that look in his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment. Recognition, the kind of gaze that comes from someone who understands what he's looking at. That night, she would tell the story at dinner, how a janitor thought he could solve her equation. They laughed. It was harmless fun, but fate has a habit of turning mockery into irony, because the next morning when she re-entered that same classroom, the equation was no longer unsolved, every variable balanced. Every term aligned, every flaw corrected. She froze. For a long time, she stared at the board, unsure whether she was dreaming or being mocked. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was neater, steadier, almost deliberate. Her pride twisted with confusion. She couldn't admit it publicly, of course. Not that someone, anyone, had done what she couldn't. So she erased it quickly, before her students arrived. But her hands shook, and yet curiosity lingered like a shadow she couldn't ignore. The next day, she staged another game, another equation, another public challenge, another invitation to humiliation. Only this time it wasn't just arrogance. It was disbelief wrapped in amusement. She wanted to prove that what had happened was coincidence, not capability. He didn't plan to respond. But something deep within him, something sacred, tired, unacknowledged, began to rise. He had spent years living quietly beneath the surface of brilliance he once owned. But when the world laughs at what it fears, the only answer left is truth. And truth, when silenced too long, always finds a way to speak again. The morning felt different. The air inside the lecture hall was charged, not with curiosity but with expectation. News had spread quickly, as rumors do in places that feed on pride. Students whispered before class, laughter half-forced, wondering if the janitor would pass by again. Even the lights seemed sharper, colder, as if waiting to expose someone. At the front stood the professor, poised, polished, confident as always. But her smile carried something new beneath its gloss, a thin thread of unease. She had erased the board, yet the memory of that flawless equation haunted her. Every symbol he had drawn was imprinted in her mind like an echo that refused to fade. She told herself it was coincidence. It had to be. The man was just a janitor, a worker with no degree, no credentials, no right to genius. But arrogance and denial often share the same face. He entered quietly, as always. His cart rolled softly over the tile floor, the scent of disinfectant trailing behind him. A few students nudged each other. Heads turned. He felt their eyes, but not their respect, just curiosity twisted with mockery. He didn't look up. He had learned long ago that attention is rarely a gift. It's a test. But then his gaze drifted. The board caught him again. A new problem, freshly written, sprawling in black ink like a challenge disguised as an invitation. It was complex. More than complex, actually. It was meant to be impossible. Even the students hadn't seen something this convoluted before. Lines of integration, partial derivatives, non-linear equations that folded into one another like walls designed to trap the unworthy. He recognized the intent behind it. It wasn't a lesson. It was bait. And she was watching. For a moment, time stood still. The two of them alone in a crowded room, their history condensed into silence. He didn't need to speak to understand what she was thinking. He saw it in the way she crossed her arms, in the confident tilt of her chin, in the faintest glimmer of provocation in her eyes. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about hierarchy, pride, and the fragile comfort of believing you were superior. The students waited, some amused, some uneasy. No one realized that they were about to witness a kind of brilliance that doesn't need a stage. He placed his mop against the wall. Slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that draws attention without asking for it. Then he approached the board, not as a challenger, but as a man walking toward something sacred. The laughter began softly. Nervous chuckles from the back row, whispers bouncing off polished walls. He ignored them. His focus was already elsewhere, tracing the equation, understanding its structure, mapping its soul. To him, mathematics wasn't work. It was language, and he was fluent in it in a way only those who love something deeply can be. He studied each symbol, the symmetry, the imbalance, the logic hidden in chaos. The room faded around him. The sound of breathing, the shifting chairs, even the judgment in their eyes, all of it dissolved into the hum of thought. He didn't see himself as a janitor anymore. In his mind, he was back where he belonged, in the universe of numbers, where truth cared for no one's title. His hand rose, hesitated, then touched the marker. The sound it made as it met the board was barely audible, but it sliced through the silence like thunder. Each stroke came alive with precision. His handwriting was firm, deliberate, elegant, the writing of someone who didn't guess. He began breaking the problem apart. Step by step, the chaos unraveled. Each equation gave birth to another, smaller, more precise one. The beauty wasn't just in the answer, it was in the process, the dance of reason unfolding in perfect rhythm. At first, the laughter grew louder, mocking his focus. But soon it wavered, cracked, and vanished. The students leaned forward unconsciously, eyes tracking every movement. The professor's smile began to fade, not completely, just enough to betray discomfort, because she was realizing something impossible. He wasn't wrong. Every step was deliberate, every connection seamless. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, no luck, only mastery. And suddenly, the hierarchy of the room flipped. The students, who once laughed with her, now watched him. Their expressions shifted from amusement to awe, from superiority to silence. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed quiet, as if the building itself was watching. Her chest tightened. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not fear, but humility. And it burned. He paused briefly, his eyes distant, a flicker of memory washing over him. The same equations once filled his notebooks in nights of study and hope, before reality took his future away. He had always promised himself he wouldn't return to that pain. Yet here he was, proving not only that he still remembered, but that the world had been wrong to forget him. He continued writing. The problem collapsed beautifully under his logic, each line clearing the path for the next until there was nothing left unsolved. When he placed the marker down, the silence that followed was absolute. For several seconds, no one breathed. He didn't look proud. He didn't even look satisfied. He simply stepped back, steady, composed, almost serene. His silence was his statement. His calm was his victory. The professor's eyes darted across the board. Every instinct in her body screamed for a mistake, a flaw, something to reclaim control. But there was none. It was flawless, elegant, correct, and worse, it was original. He hadn't just solved it. He had improved it. The realization hit her like a wave she couldn't brace against. The very equation she had used as a weapon of mockery had turned into her mirror, showing her the cracks in her brilliance. She felt the burn of humiliation, but beneath it, something unexpected. Admiration. The students broke the silence first, a whisper, a murmur, then applause. Tentative at first, then louder, unstoppable. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, rising like justice itself. He didn't stay to bask in it. He simply nodded once, retrieved his mop, and left. Each step out of that room felt lighter than the one before. The air tasted different. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the quiet realization that you no longer owe the world your silence. Behind him, the applause continued, and the professor remained frozen, eyes locked on the board that had betrayed her pride and rewarded his patience. When the students finally left, she stayed alone in the empty hall. The sunlight slanted through the windows, cutting through the chalk dust like truth through illusion. She approached the board slowly, tracing his writing with trembling fingers. The symbols felt alive, almost sacred. She realized then that genius has never belonged to the privileged. It has always belonged to the persistent. The man she mocked had carried more wisdom in silence than she had ever spoken in words. She thought about the years he must have lost, the doors that had closed, the talent that had gone unseen. And for the first time, she didn't feel superior. She felt small, because arrogance builds walls. But humility? Humility builds bridges, and he had just walked across one she didn't even know existed. For a long while, she didn't move. The lecture hall, once alive with arrogance and applause, now stood suspended in quiet revelation. The sunlight painted the chalkboard gold, illuminating every symbol he had left behind like a sacred inscription. Dust particles shimmered in the light, tiny, weightless witnesses to the undoing of pride. She exhaled slowly, realizing her hands were trembling. It wasn't fear. It was exposure. For years, she had carried herself as the embodiment of brilliance, the professor whose mind could bend logic, whose students worshipped her certainty. She had taught equations, but she had forgotten humility. Now, a janitor's handwriting had reminded her. Every number he'd written seemed to echo the same message. Truth belongs to no one. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. His quiet walk to the board, the confidence that didn't shout, the steady rhythm of chalk against surface, the stillness that silenced hundreds. There had been no arrogance in him, no desire to humiliate her. Only focus, pure, unbroken focus. And that was what humbled her most. He hadn't tried to win. He had simply been right. In a single afternoon, the foundation of her identity cracked. Her lectures, her awards, her applause, all felt lighter, hollow, insubstantial compared to the weight of his calm truth. The door closed behind him hours ago, but the echo of his presence lingered. The janitor, the man she never even greeted by name, had just redefined the word genius. Her heart ached, not from humiliation now, but from a deeper, more honest pain, the recognition of injustice. How many minds like his had been silenced by circumstance? How many discoveries buried under uniforms, overalls, poverty, and prejudice? She felt the sharp sting of her own complicity. The world had conditioned her to measure worth by degrees, by accents, by skin, by polish. And she had obeyed, until a man with rough hands and kind eyes broke her equation of superiority without saying a word. The chalkboard still gleamed with his solution. She studied it, not as a critic now, but as a student. The logic was impeccable, but what struck her most was its beauty. It wasn't written like an answer. It was written like art. The transitions were seamless, the symmetry elegant. He hadn't solved a problem. He had told a story. And in that story, she saw him, the version of him that once dreamed, that once sat in classrooms like this, that once believed talent was enough. She turned away from the board, her throat tight. Outside the windows, the campus buzzed as usual, students laughing, professors lecturing, the world unaware that something extraordinary had just happened within these walls. But word travels fast when it defies expectation. By evening, the whispers had become wildfire. The story spread across departments, cafeterias, dormitories. The janitor solved it. No one knew the full truth, only fragments of awe. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others believed it instantly. But one thing united everyone who heard it: disbelief wrapped in wonder. When he returned the next morning, everything felt different. He sensed it the moment he stepped onto campus, the way eyes lingered longer, the way conversations hushed when he passed. The silence he once used as armor had turned into a spotlight. He hated attention, but this was different. This wasn't mockery anymore. It was respect, quiet and unspoken, but real. He continued his routine. Mopped the halls, emptied trash, polished the same floors that had heard his humiliation. But now, each stroke of the mop felt like a ritual of peace rather than servitude. The classroom where it happened was empty. The board was clean again. Yet, if you looked closely, faint traces of chalk remained, the ghost of his brilliance refusing to fade completely. He stood before it one last time, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't need validation. He didn't need applause. The universe had already balanced its equation. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached. She stood at the door, hesitant, changed. Gone was the posture of authority, the effortless confidence. What remained was a woman stripped of pretense, carrying humility like something sacred she had just rediscovered. She watched him for a moment before stepping inside. Her eyes softened as they fell upon the faint traces of chalk, her board, now his. In that silence, the two of them stood surrounded by what the world rarely sees, the meeting of apology and forgiveness without a single word spoken. There was no need for her to confess, no need for him to condemn. The truth already lived between them, written once in chalk and now in understanding. He nodded once, not out of pride, but respect, and quietly returned to his work. She lingered behind, eyes glassy with realization. He had done more than solve an equation. He had rewritten a truth she didn't know needed correcting, and she vowed, silently, that she would never again let ignorance disguise itself as intellect. That night, when the halls emptied and lights dimmed, she sat alone in her office, staring at a blank sheet of paper. For the first time in her career, she wasn't trying to prove anything. She was trying to understand. She began writing, not a new equation, but a letter, a recommendation, a request. The janitor's name, once forgotten, now stood at the top of the page. She described what she had witnessed, the brilliance, the humility, the truth that had silenced arrogance. She sent it not to a colleague, but to the dean. She didn't know if anything would come of it. But she knew this. Silence should never again be mistaken for ignorance. The next morning, the world outside carried on as usual. Students hurried to class, professors prepared lectures, and janitors pushed their carts down shining hallways. But within those walls, something had changed forever. The equation had been solved. Yes, but something far greater had been corrected. Perspective. And in that correction lay the moral of every story like this one, a truth older than mathematics itself. Genius doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists. Waiting for the moment arrogance gives it room to breathe. That day, a university full of intellects learned what intelligence truly means. And a man who had spent years erasing other people's work finally left his own mark. Morning broke softly over the campus, spilling gold across brick walls that had never looked so alive. The university carried on as it always did, lectures echoing, students hurrying, the hum of knowledge vibrating through every hallway. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something invisible had shifted. The janitor walked those same halls as he always had, yet nothing about him was the same. The same mop, the same steps, the same quiet presence. But behind that stillness lived a man who had finally been seen. The students greeted him now with nods of respect. Some offered shy smiles. A few couldn't meet his eyes, ashamed of how easily they had laughed the day before. But he didn't need their words. He had learned long ago that respect is never something you ask for. It's something the world gives when truth leaves it no choice. He carried his cart down the corridor, sunlight glinting off its metal edges. Every squeak of the wheels seemed to echo with quiet triumph. He wasn't proud in the way people imagine pride. He was free in a way they would never understand. Freedom, he realized, isn't the absence of labor. It's the absence of shame. That equation had done more than reveal his mind. It had returned his dignity. He stopped by the same lecture hall, empty now, washed in soft light. The board was clean again, his chalk traces erased. But somehow it didn't matter. What he had written there had already spread far beyond the walls that once confined it. Because truth has a way of traveling. Quietly, persistently. From one conscience to another. Across the campus, the professor sat in her office, hands resting on her desk. The letter she had written for him had already been sent. The dean had read it, and for the first time in her career, she didn't care about what it might cost her reputation. Some truths are worth the risk of losing the comfort of false superiority. She had spent the night rereading her own research, every paper, every theorem, every proof. They all felt different now. For years, she had believed that knowledge was power, but now she understood. Knowledge is only power when shared with humility. She remembered his eyes, calm, patient, unwavering, and felt a quiet gratitude that life had sent her a mirror disguised as a man with a mop. In that mirror, she saw herself clearly for the first time. The following week, the university announced a guest lecture on unrecognized genius, when knowledge lives outside classrooms. It was her idea, but it wasn't hers to deliver. She sat in the front row, while the man everyone had ignored for years stood at the front of the room. He didn't lecture. He didn't teach formulas or theories. He simply told a story, not with ego, but with grace. He spoke about curiosity, about failure, about the beauty of questions that have no audience. He spoke about how dreams can survive even in silence, how brilliance can bloom in places the world refuses to look. The students listened, every one of them. Some had tears in their eyes. Others looked away, ashamed of the way they had once laughed. And when he finished, the applause was not loud or explosive. It was slow, deep, and sincere. The kind of applause that comes not from excitement, but from respect. In that moment, a janitor became a teacher again, and the professor became a student once more. Time moved forward. Months passed. The story spread quietly through academic circles, an anonymous account of a forgotten genius who solved the unsolvable. Some dismissed it as fiction. Others searched for his name only to find none, because he never gave interviews, never sought recognition. His pride was in the act itself, in proving that truth, when spoken through action, doesn't need an audience to echo. The professor, however, made sure his legacy lived. She started a new program, one that offered scholarships to underprivileged students who showed extraordinary talent in mathematics and science. She named it the Equation of Equality, and at the top of every scholarship certificate, written in faint gray print, were 5 simple words: never underestimate the quiet ones. She kept one of those certificates framed in her office, not as decoration, but as penance. It reminded her daily that arrogance is the enemy of discovery, and that genius has no uniform. Years later, long after he had retired, a young student found him sitting beneath a tree on campus, reading an old mathematics journal. The student recognized him, not from the headlines, but from whispers, from legends that refused to fade. The student thanked him awkwardly for inspiring them to study mathematics. He smiled softly and closed the journal. For a moment, he saw himself in that young face, the hunger, the hope, the belief that brilliance can rewrite fate, and in that brief, quiet exchange, the circle of justice completed itself. When he passed away years later, it wasn't front-page news. There were no cameras, no speeches. But the university lowered its flag for a day, an act small in gesture but enormous in meaning. And that night, as the janitors cleaned the halls, one of them stopped by the old lecture room. The board was blank, but she wrote something on it before turning off the lights. He solved more than an equation. He solved us. The story of that moment became part of the university's folklore, told to new students every year during orientation, not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson of awakening. Professors spoke his story as a reminder that the human mind is not defined by hierarchy and the human heart is not measured in titles. The professor never forgot him. In every lecture she gave afterward, she carried a piece of his humility into her words. Her tone softened. Her examples grew inclusive. She reminded her students that intellect without empathy is blindness disguised as brilliance. And when she spoke of him, she didn't use his name. She used his example. Because anonymity, in his case, wasn't erasure, it was purity. It was the proof that greatness doesn't need to be seen to exist. As time wore on, generations changed. The building was renovated. New faces replaced old ones. Yet one thing remained untouched: the small brass plaque beneath the lecture board. It read, "Dedicated to those whose minds were never heard, but whose truth changed everything." And in the reflection of that polished brass, you could still see the faint outline of chalk dust, proof that some stories never really fade. In the end, the world didn't remember him as a janitor or a mathematician. It remembered him as something far greater. A mirror. A mirror that forced humanity to look at itself and see the quiet genius it so often overlooks. And perhaps that's the real lesson his life left behind. That beneath every uniform, every accent, every silence, there might live a mind capable of changing the way we understand not only mathematics, but each other. Because the greatest equation he ever solved wasn't the one written on that board. It was the one between arrogance and humility, ignorance and respect, human and human. And in that perfect balance, he proved that equality isn't theory, it's truth.